She wasn't supposed to hear it, but she did. And when the Duke who dismissed her in one careless sentence kept appearing in her library, her ballroom, her park, she realized his apology wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The morning Miss Eleanor Hartwell arrived in London, it rained. This was not in itself remarkable. London in April made a habit of rain the way it made a habit of gossip, constantly, without apology, and with particular attention to the moments one was least prepared for it. What was remarkable was that Eleanor stood at the window of the narrow Marylebone townhouse her mother had let for the season, watched the water streak the glass, and felt something she had not expected to feel upon finally arriving in the city that was supposed to save the family's prospects. Relief. Not at the rain, at the grey, at the particular London quality of light that flattened everything and made no one look especially well, which was, she had long since concluded, the most democratic thing about the place. "You are doing that thing with your face," said Jane from the doorway. Eleanor did not turn from the window. "I have only one face, I cannot be doing something different with it." "You have several." Jane came to stand beside her, close enough that their reflections overlapped in the glass. Jane fair and assembled, Eleanor dark-haired and, by her own frank accounting, unremarkable. "That one is the face you make when you are deciding something." "I am deciding nothing, I am watching it rain." "You are deciding whether to enjoy yourself this season, or to treat the entire enterprise as an extended exercise in endurance." Jane paused. "I am asking you, as your sister, and your only ally in this house, to at least attempt the former." Eleanor touched the brooch at her collar, a small thing, garnet set in old gold, her grandmother's and now hers. The metal was cool. She released it. "I make no promises." Jane sighed in the particular way that meant she had expected exactly this answer, and had asked anyway on principle. The insult had happened 4 weeks earlier, in Shropshire, at a gathering hosted by Sir William Peel at his country house, a pre-season affair, neighbours assembled before the annual migration to London, the atmosphere, the slightly forced joviality of people who had spent the winter largely in their own company and were remembering how to perform sociability. Eleanor had not particularly wanted to attend. Her mother had required it. She had spent most of the evening in conversation with Sir William's wife, a sensible woman who shared Eleanor's opinion of card parties, and had been making her way back from the withdrawing room to the main drawing room when she heard voices through the half-open door of the adjoining study. She stopped because she recognized one of the voices. Lord Peel, Sir William's son, young, amiable, a man who meant well with the consistency of someone who had never been made to account for the consequences of meaning well. She did not recognize the other voice immediately. Low, deliberate. The voice of a man accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. "Hartwell girl," Lord Peel was saying. "The younger one, sensible creature from what I can tell. Not after anyone's title or fortune. Father's dead, family's respectable. She'd be no trouble at all, Carwick, and you could do considerably." A pause. She heard the clink of a glass set down, then, "She is plain and dull. Find me someone worth the effort." Eleanor stood very still in the corridor. She was aware of several things simultaneously: that her hand had found the brooch at her collar, that the voices had moved on to another subject with the ease of men who had been in that room 4 hours and were tired and saying whatever came quickest, and that the particular quality of silence inside her was not hurt exactly, but something more functional. The kind of quiet that comes when a question you hadn't known you were asking receives a definitive answer. She had not been considered. She had been disposed of. She went back to the drawing room, found Jane, said she had a headache, and went home. She did not tell anyone. There was nothing to tell, or rather nothing that would improve with telling. She had learned something useful about the man behind that voice, and about the conditions under which he formed his judgments. She intended to apply it. The man's voice belonged to Edmund Fairclough, Duke of Carwick. She did not learn this until 3 days later, when her mother mentioned with considerable excitement that the Duke had been at the Peel party and had Eleanor noticed him, because he was enormously eligible and reportedly looking for a wife, and Jane, darling Jane, had been in the same room as him for nearly an hour. Eleanor had not noticed him. She had only heard him. "I believe he found the evening unremarkable," she said, and said nothing else. London in the second week of April assembled itself around the Hartwell sisters with the particular energy of a city that runs on new arrivals and the stories attached to them. Their mother, Mrs. Hartwell, was energetic in her ambitions and realistic in her means. The Marylebone house was modest, their introductions were adequate, and Jane, who had a genuine sweetness that translated well in drawing rooms, was already receiving morning callers by the 4th day. Eleanor received no morning callers. She did not expect to. She went instead to the lending library on Bond Street, which she had identified on her second day as one of the few places in London where a woman could stand for 20 minutes without being required to explain herself to anyone, provided she brought her maid, which she did, a quiet girl named Marta, who had the excellent quality of finding a chair near the door and staying in it. She was there on a Tuesday morning, 10 days into the season, working her way along the natural history shelves with the focused pleasure of someone who has located a pocket of genuine quiet in a loud city, when the bell above the door announced a new arrival, and she did not look up. She became aware of the new arrival by degrees, first a stillness in the room, the kind that happened when someone entered who was used to causing it. Then the librarian's voice, an octave more deferential than usual. Then footsteps, unhurried, moving along the opposite shelf. She looked up. He was taller than she had imagined. She noticed with some irritation that she had imagined him at all. Dark coat, well cut without announcing it, a face that was, by any fair accounting, extraordinarily well made, which annoyed her on no logical grounds. He was reading the spine of a book with the expression of a man who had expected to be alone. He had not seen her. Eleanor looked back at her shelf. She selected a volume on migratory birds, opened it, and read the same sentence 4 times. He moved along his shelf. She moved along hers. For 3 minutes they maintained the polite fiction of mutual invisibility that is the particular social contract of libraries. Then he reached the end of his row and turned, and they were 6 feet apart, and there was nowhere to look except at each other. His eyes were grey. They registered her with the polite blankness of a man who does not immediately place a face. Eleanor closed her book. "Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression. The blankness sharpened into something more careful. "Miss Hartwell." She said it without assistance, without warmth, and with the particular precision of a woman completing a sentence she had been composing for 4 weeks. "Eleanor Hartwell. We have not been formally introduced. You will perhaps recall that introduction was considered unnecessary." A pause, long enough to be interesting. "I beg your pardon?" "I was standing in the corridor outside Sir William Peel's study on the 14th of March, Eleanor said. Her voice was level. She had decided, somewhere between Shropshire and London, that if she ever found herself face to face with this voice, she would not pretend. It was not courage, exactly, it was economy. "I heard you. I expect you did not intend to be heard, nevertheless." She inclined her head, the precise degree required by courtesy. "I hope you find what you are looking for, Your Grace. The natural history section is quite good." She replaced the book on the shelf, walked past him, close enough that she could have counted the buttons on his coat, and crossed to where Marta sat by the door. "We are leaving," she said quietly. Outside on Bond Street, she walked half a block before she permitted herself a single breath that was not entirely steady. Then she straightened, touched the brooch at her collar, and hailed a hackney. She did not tell Jane what had happened. Jane would either be horrified or delighted, and Eleanor had not yet determined which response she was less equipped to manage. What she had not anticipated, what she had not accounted for in her neat plan to state the fact and move on, was that moving on would require him to have the grace to behave as though it had never happened. She had not considered that he might not have that grace. The first ball of the season was held at Grosvenor Square, in the townhouse of Lady Fenwick, who collected people the way some women collected porcelain, with an eye for quality, a pleasure in arrangement, and a faint ruthlessness about anything that didn't display well. The rooms were full. The chandeliers were magnificent. The music was competent. Eleanor stood near the wall with Jane, who was already being sought for the next set, and held a glass of lemonade she had no intention of drinking, and watched the room with the equanimity of a woman who has made peace with the wall. "You could dance," Jane said. "I could also stand here. Standing here requires less coordination. Mr. Alderton asked after you." "Mr. Alderton asks after everyone. It is a tick, not a distinction." Jane opened her mouth to respond, and then her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Eleanor tracked the direction of her gaze without appearing to do so. The Duke of Carwick had entered the room. He was with Lord Peel, who was already scanning the crowd with the cheerful acquisitiveness of a man who likes a party. Carwick was doing something different, a slow, systematic reading of the room that was less pleasure and more inventory. The expression of a man who has been in too many of these rooms and has stopped expecting to find anything new in them. He would not see her. There were 300 people in this room, and Eleanor Hartwell was not, by any established metric, the sort of person who got seen in a crowd. He saw her. Not immediately. He had been in the room perhaps 4 minutes, had exchanged words with Lord Peel, had declined something a footman offered, had been approached and briefly engaged by a woman in yellow silk. And then his gaze moved, without apparent intention, and landed on Eleanor, and stopped. She did not look away, that at least she had decided. He held her gaze for a moment that had no business being as long as it was. Then he looked away first. She noted this with the detached precision of a scientist recording a result, and returned her attention to the room. "He was looking at you," Jane said quietly. "He was looking at this section of wall. I happened to be standing in front of it." Jane said nothing, which was in its way louder than agreement. Lord Peel found Eleanor 40 minutes later, during a lull between sets, wearing the expression of a man on a mission he considered both worthwhile and mildly nerve-making. "Miss Hartwell," he said with genuine warmth, "you look very well. Is that a garnet brooch? My grandmother had one very similar." "It was my grandmother's," Eleanor said. "Charming. Absolutely charming. I wonder, that is, Carwick is just over there, and I thought perhaps he is very good company once you get past the—" Lord Peel gestured vaguely at the air, which presumably represented whatever was on the surface of the Duke that needed getting past. "Lord Peel," Eleanor said gently, "you are very kind. You are also operating on incomplete information." Lord Peel looked uncertain. "I beg your pardon?" "His Grace and I have already met. We have an understanding of sorts." She smiled at him, the small, precise smile she deployed in situations requiring courtesy without compliance. "I would not trouble him further on my account. I am sure he has a great deal to attend to." Lord Peel looked across the room to where Carwick stood, then back to Eleanor, then opened his mouth, closed it, and retreated with the expression of a man who suspects he has miscalculated, but cannot identify where. Eleanor finished her lemonade. It was, she decided, quite good. He approached her himself. She had not expected that. It was near the end of the evening, the crowd thinning, the music slower, the candles lower. Eleanor had spent a pleasant hour in conversation with a Mrs. Graves, who collected botanical illustrations and had strong opinions about Linnaeus, and was retrieving her shawl from a chair when she became aware of someone stopping beside her. "Miss Hartwell." She took her time with the shawl, then she looked up. "Your Grace, I owe you an apology." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed but not softened, direct, uncomfortable, stripped of elaboration. "Do you?" she said. "What I said in Shropshire was—" "To your opinion," Eleanor said, "you need not apologize for holding one. Most people form opinions of others on evidence considerably thinner than a tired evening and a brief glance. You were at least efficient." He was quiet. She had the distinct impression she had not said what he expected, and that this surprised him more than the confrontation in the library had. "I was unkind," he said. "Yes." She settled the shawl around her shoulders. The garnets at her collar caught the candlelight, a brief dark gleam. "You were also overheard, which I imagine you consider the greater inconvenience." "That is not—" He stopped. "No. The greater inconvenience is that I was careless and wrong." Eleanor stilled. She studied him, the grey eyes, the controlled expression, the quality of a man who has said something true and is waiting to find out what it costs him. She could not read him well enough yet to know if this was honesty or strategy. She had been in London 10 days. She had learned to distrust comfortable conclusions. "Time will tell, Your Grace," she said. She was pleased with how steady it came out. "Good evening." She walked away. She did not touch the brooch. That too, she noted. London in the season had a particular talent for repetition, the same faces in the same rooms, the same conversations performed with minor variations, the same dances at marginally different tempos. Eleanor had anticipated this. What she had not anticipated was that the same face would keep appearing in her specific section of whatever room she happened to occupy, with a frequency that exceeded coincidence by a margin she could not politely ignore. Carwick was at the Ashmore breakfast 3 days after the Fenwick ball. He was across the room in conversation with 2 men Eleanor did not know and did not approach her. But she was aware of him the way one is aware of a window in a warm room, not looking directly, but knowing the direction. He was at the private concert at Mrs. Dalton's on the following Thursday. She arrived late, took the only remaining seat, and discovered when she looked up that it placed her 4 rows behind him and slightly to the left, which meant that for the entirety of Mr. Hartington's performance of Haydn, she had an unobstructed view of the back of Carwick's neck and the line of his jaw when he turned occasionally to say something to the woman beside him. The woman beside him was Lady Sophia Wren. Eleanor had heard of Lady Sophia in the particular way one hears of a figure discussed rather than encountered. Second daughter of an earl, 23, beautiful in the composed architectural way that translated to canvas as poise and in a drawing room as effortless presence. She was the kind of woman London approved of. She never said anything surprising, never wore anything questionable, and had the gift of appearing at ease in any room without appearing to have made an effort. Beside her, Carwick looked like a man performing contentment. Eleanor was aware this was an uncharitable reading. She was also aware it was the one her eyes kept returning to. At the interval, she was standing near the refreshment table, accepting tea she didn't want from a footman she didn't know, when Lord Peel materialized at her elbow. "Miss Hartwell, you came." "It appears so." "Excellent concert. Do you enjoy Haydn?" "Very much." Lord Peel glanced toward where Carwick and Lady Sophia stood together, then back to Eleanor with the expression of a man solving a puzzle he hasn't been given all the pieces to. "He mentioned you," he said. "Carwick, after the Fenwick ball." Eleanor kept her eyes on her tea. "Did he?" "Said you were interesting. Which from Carwick is, I mean to say, he doesn't usually—" Lord Peel abandoned the sentence and began a new one. "Are you enjoying the season, Miss Hartwell?" "More than I expected," she said, which was true and not entirely because of the Haydn. The lending library on Bond Street became, over the following 2 weeks, a location of some significance. Eleanor went on Tuesdays and Fridays, as she had established early in the season. She brought Marta, who brought her knitting, and they had settled into a reliable routine, Eleanor along the shelves, Marta in the chair by the door, an arrangement that suited them both. She did not adjust her schedule. If the Duke of Carwick also frequented the library on Tuesdays and Fridays, if he was there the second Tuesday and the third Friday, if he had apparently developed an interest in natural history that had not previously manifested, that was his own affair and nothing to do with her. On the third Tuesday he spoke first. "The Pennant," he said from 2 shelves away without preamble. "Have you read it?" Eleanor located him through the gap in the books. He was holding a volume, not looking at her, reading the spine of an adjacent one. "British Zoology." "Yes, several years ago." "Is it worth the time?" "That depends on how you feel about detailed engravings of fish." A pause, mixed feelings. "Then I would recommend the 3rd volume, and approach the 4th with caution." He selected a different book. She returned to her own. For 10 minutes they occupied the library in the quiet that is not quite silence, the specific company of 2 people who have decided, without discussing it, to tolerate each other's presence. Marta's knitting needles clicked softly from her post by the door. "Miss Hartwell." "Your Grace." "I did not expect to find you interested in natural history." Eleanor looked up. He had moved to the end of the shelf and could see her properly now. His expression was careful, attentive in the way she was beginning to identify as his default when he was not performing indifference. "What did you expect to find me interested in?" she asked. He considered this with more seriousness than the question perhaps warranted. "I confess I did not think about it." "Then we are back to efficient," Eleanor said. "You looked, formed no hypothesis, and moved on. At least your methodology is consistent." He looked at her. The careful expression shifted away from careful, toward something with more friction in it. "What do you read?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. She had learned in the past weeks that Carwick was accustomed to prompt responses, and that the small pause of a woman who was not hurrying to answer him produced in him a focused attention that was, she admitted only to herself, interesting to observe. "Natural history," she said. "Political economy when I can find it. Published correspondence, travellers' accounts. My father had a good library and no sons, which meant we were permitted to use it." "Your father is dead." 2 years ago, yes." "I am sorry." He said it without decoration, which made it more useful than the usual kind of condolence. "So am I," she said. She turned back to her shelf. "The Pennant is on the 2nd shelf from the top. You will need the steps." He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him move toward the library steps, and the small sound of a book being removed, and the room settled back into its particular piece. The morning call happened because of Jane. Jane, who had acquired a considerable circle of acquaintance in her 3 weeks in London, had been introduced through Mrs. Graves to Lady Fenwick, and through Lady Fenwick to approximately half the drawing rooms in Mayfair. She had mentioned in passing to someone Eleanor didn't know that her sister had some acquaintance with the Duke of Carwick, the kind of information that moves through a London season the way water moves through chalk, quickly and without obvious mechanism. The consequence was that on a Wednesday morning, Mrs. Hartwell was in a state of suppressed excitement she was managing badly, and Jane was looking at Eleanor with an expression that combined apology and fascination in equal measure. "He sent a card," Mrs. Hartwell said, "asking if he might call this morning. A duke, Eleanor, a duke sent a card to this house." "Cards are sent to houses, not to their occupants' social positions," Eleanor said from behind her toast. "Do not be clever at me this morning, I cannot bear it." Mrs. Hartwell pressed the card to her chest. "Jane, tell her she must wear the blue." "She will not wear the blue," Jane said with the certainty of long experience. "She will wear whatever she was already planning to wear, and it will look perfectly fine." Eleanor was wearing a grey morning dress and the garnet brooch. She had put the brooch on before she knew about the card, which she noted with the scrupulous internal honesty she applied to most things and found inconvenient in this instance. He arrived at 11. He was shown into the small sitting room, which looked better than it deserved to, thanks to Jane's arrangement of some inexpensive flowers. He occupied it with the particular quality of a tall man in a modest room who is carefully not making the room feel small. Mrs. Hartwell was present throughout, positioned near the window with her embroidery. Propriety satisfied, observation optimized. Eleanor sat across from Carwick with her hands in her lap and her back straight, the brooch at her collar catching whatever watery April light managed the curtains. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "thank you for receiving me." "My mother receives you," Eleanor said. "I am merely present." Mrs. Hartwell produced a sound she converted at the last moment into a cough. Something crossed Carwick's face, the almost thing she had seen before at the library, when she had not hurried to answer. Contained amusement, precisely managed. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the library. It is an excellent library. About the conversation we had there, about what you read. We have had several conversations there. You will need to be more specific. The one about your father's library," he said, "and what you read. I've been thinking about it, about the fact that I formed my opinion of you at a distance, at the end of a long and tedious evening, because Peel suggested I look, and I looked, and decided before I had properly focused, and said the thing that would close the subject." He paused. "That is what happened. I want to be accurate about it." Eleanor held this. He was not softening the account, he was making it worse, more specific, more honest, which was not what she had expected. "It is possible," she said carefully, "that even a considered opinion formed at leisure might have reached the same conclusion." "It is possible," he agreed, "but it would have been a different kind of wrong. This kind was careless, and I do not like being careless." "No," she said, "I imagine you don't." A silence. Mrs. Hartwell had set down her embroidery and was now openly watching both of them. "I am asking," Carwick said with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to be plain, "whether we might continue with accurate information on both sides." "I don't think beginning again is quite right," Eleanor said. "We cannot unknow what has already happened. What you are asking, I think, is whether we might continue with the full account in hand." "Yes," he said, "and that." "I am prepared to continue," Eleanor said. "I am not prepared to pretend Shropshire did not happen. I'm not asking you to." "Good, then we are agreed." He left 20 minutes later, having consumed tea he barely touched, and answered Mrs. Hartwell's questions about his Derbyshire estate with the patience of a man who understood what was happening and chose not to be unkind about it. At the door, he paused. "Friday," he said, "the library." Eleanor said nothing. He left. Mrs. Hartwell turned from the window with the expression of a woman whose understanding of events has undergone significant revision. "Eleanor." "Don't," said Eleanor. "I only want to—" "I know what you want to say, Mama. Please don't say it." Mrs. Hartwell pressed her lips together, but she was smiling, and Eleanor, despite all reasonable intentions, found she could not quite compose a proper argument against it. She went to the library on Friday. She had told herself with great reasonableness that she always went on Fridays, and that there was nothing significant about this particular Friday, and that she had wanted to return the pennant, which she had borrowed and finished in 2 sittings. 3rd volume, excellent. 4th, adequate. He was already there when she arrived, which she registered with studied neutrality. Marta took her customary chair. Eleanor moved toward the natural history section. They spent an hour among the shelves. It was, she would later reflect, a more comfortable hour than it had any right to be. He asked questions with genuine interest, not the performed interest of a man in a drawing room pretending to find a woman's opinions charming, but the focused attention of someone who found the answers useful. He had read more than she expected. He argued 2 of her positions and conceded one, doing both with the even-handedness of a man accustomed to being right, but not committed to it as a point of pride. "You disagree with Malthus," he said at one point. "I find his conclusions convenient for the people who agree with them and inconvenient for everyone else. That's not an argument against the conclusions. No, but it is an argument for examining the premises more carefully than people generally bother to." He looked at her with the contained, almost amusement. "You would have been a formidable barrister. I would have been a formidable a great many things, had the century been arranged differently. As it is, I am simply a woman who reads." "You are not simply anything," he said. He said it without inflection, not a compliment, not a flourish, just the flat statement of what he believed. And then he returned his attention to the book in his hand, as though he had said something unremarkable. Eleanor looked at the shelf in front of her. She touched the brooch. Then she took down the next book and opened it. The complications arrived, as complications in a London season always do, in the form of other people. The first arrived on a Friday evening at a card party at Lord Dunmore's house, in the form of Lady Sophia Wren, who sat down beside Eleanor with the composed ease of a woman who has decided to find something out and has chosen a direct route. "Miss Hartwell," she said, arranging her cards with precision, "I believe we have not been properly introduced." "I believe you're right," Eleanor said. "Lady Sophia." "I have heard your name mentioned once or twice." Lady Sophia's expression was pleasant and gave nothing away. "You are acquainted with the Duke of Carwick." "We have some acquaintance, yes." "He speaks well of you?" Lady Sophia studied her cards. "Edmund does not often speak well of people. I have known him 4 years, and the people he speaks well of could be counted without removing one's gloves." Eleanor processed this without showing it. "He is discerning," she said. "He is many things." Lady Sophia looked up, and her eyes were not unfriendly, careful in the way of a woman measuring something she is not yet ready to name. "You go to the lending library on Tuesdays and Fridays?" "I do." "He began going on Tuesdays and Fridays approximately 3 weeks ago. He went on Wednesdays before that." She returned her gaze to the cards. "I thought you might find that interesting." Eleanor found it several things simultaneously, interesting being only one of them. "Lady Sophia," she said, "what are you telling me?" Lady Sophia arranged her last card and looked up with the expression of a woman who has decided to be plain. "I am telling you," she said quietly, "that Edmund is a man who made a decision some months ago on grounds that seemed sensible at the time, and that he has not, to my knowledge, revisited. Sensible decisions made before certain information was available sometimes benefit from revisiting." She smiled, genuinely, which made it worse in one way and better in another. "I play a very poor hand of whist, Miss Hartwell. Shall we proceed?" Eleanor looked at her cards. Her hand was, as it happened, excellent. "Let's," she said. The second complication arrived in the form of Lord Peel, who intercepted Eleanor at the Dunmore supper table with the expression of a man who has been doing arithmetic and doesn't like his answer. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Do you?" "Shropshire," he said. "The party. I did not know you could hear us. I should not have spoken of you that way in any case, as though any of you were—" He gestured unhappily at the air. "I am sorry, Miss Hartwell. It was thoughtless of me, and I am ashamed of it." Eleanor set down the serving spoon. Lord Peel was looking at her with the genuine anguish of a decent man who has discovered he has caused harm. That was worth something. "You were trying to help," she said. "I was, rather, which doesn't excuse the manner of it. No, but it goes some way toward explaining it." She picked up her plate. "The cold chicken is quite good, Lord Peel. I recommend it." He looked at her with something between relief and admiration. "You are not what I expected, Miss Hartwell." "Funny," she said, moving along the table. "I keep hearing that." She saw Carwick at the supper table 20 minutes later. He was at the far end, standing with 2 men she recognized as members of Parliament, not performing contentment, but genuinely engaged, arguing a point with the focused energy of a man who cared about the outcome. She watched him for a moment, the animation in his face, the slight forward lean of a person who has forgotten to be careful. She had not seen him not careful before. He looked across the room, his habit of reading it, and caught her watching. She did not look away. He held her gaze, and the animation changed, became more specific, less general, aimed. She looked away first this time. She noted that too. May arrived with warmth the city was not prepared for, and the season accelerated with it. More invitations, more obligations, more rooms that were too hot, and conversations that went on too long. London's social mathematics were reliable. Proximity plus frequency produced either boredom or significance. Eleanor was not bored. This was, she had decided, a problem. She had come to London with a clear-eyed understanding of her position. Second daughter, no fortune, no particular social currency. She had come to be useful in Jane's season, to be present at the right events, to do the necessary work of a family that required appearances it could barely afford. She had not come to be interested in anyone. She was interested. She was interested in the way a woman is interested, when she has spent 3 weeks noticing the precise quality of a person's attention, when they are performing and when they are not, how they move through a room, what makes them laugh, the contained almost laugh she had catalogued across a dozen encounters, how they argue, how they concede. She was interested the way she was interested in a good book, with the particular absorption of finding more in it than she had expected. This would not do. Not because of the distance between their positions, which was real and needed no emphasis, but because of Lady Sophia Wren, who sat beside Carwick at 3 of the last 4 evening events, who wore white and pearl with the serenity of a woman already inhabiting a future she has been fitted for. The situation had a shape, and Eleanor was honest enough to see it. She went to the library on Tuesday. He was there. Marta knitted by the door. They discussed Burke's correspondence and argued about Ireland, and she went home and sat at the window until Jane came to find her. "Tell me," Jane said, sitting on the window seat without ceremony. "There is nothing to tell." "Eleanor." "There is nothing I am going to tell you. It is not the same thing." Eleanor looked at her. "It is not the same thing, Jane." Jane was quiet, in the way that meant she was choosing among several true things. "He is nearly engaged to Lady Sophia," she said finally. "I know." "Nearly is not fully. Nearly is close enough to require no action on my part." Eleanor looked back at the window. "I am not taking any action. I am simply observing." "You are doing that thing with your face," Jane said. "I have only one face." "You have several. The one you're doing now is the one where something has already happened, and you haven't decided to acknowledge it yet." Eleanor said nothing. The city outside was still light at 8 o'clock now. The sounds of it coming through the glass in the particular flattened way of sounds that don't belong to you. She was aware of the brooch at her collar, which she had not taken off since she could not remember when. The thing that could not stay as it was arrived on a Friday. She had gone to the library, the book she wanted to return, the familiar shelves Marta in her chair, and had stayed 40 minutes and returned her book and selected 2 others and was heading toward the door when Carwick came in from the street. They stopped, 6 feet apart, because that was apparently the distance London kept producing between them. "I did not think you came on Fridays consistently," he said. "I come on Tuesdays and Fridays," she said. "I have always come on Tuesdays and Fridays." Something in his expression shifted, brief, readable only because she had been reading him for weeks. He had known, and had come anyway, and had just been caught knowing. "I would like to walk," he said, "in the park if you are willing." She should say no. The reasons were clear and multiple and valid. "I have Marta with me," she said. "It would not be improper." "No," he agreed, "it would not." She considered for a moment. "Very well." The park in May had the green excess of a city that has been grey too long and overcorrected. They walked along the path near the water, Marta trailing at the proper distance, close enough to satisfy propriety, far enough to make conversation private. The few other people present were sufficiently distant to constitute witness without constituting audience. He spoke first. "I have been thinking about what you said at the Fenwick ball, about continuing with accurate information. I remember saying it. I want to be accurate with you." He did not look at her. He was watching the water, which gave her the leisure to look at his profile without being observed. "I have not been entirely accurate in how I have conducted this." "What would you call it accurately?" she asked. "I have been coming to the library on your days." I had gathered. "I have been thinking about our conversations, considerably more than is—" He stopped. "I am nearly committed to Lady Sophia, not formally, no formal understanding exists, but there is a direction, an expectation on my part, and I believe on hers." Eleanor kept her eyes on the path ahead. "Then why are you telling me this?" "Because I told you I would be accurate," he said, "and because I find I cannot continue as we have been and be honest about it, to you or to myself." Eleanor stopped walking. He stopped a half-step later. She turned to look at him properly. The focused, careful attention she had catalogued across a dozen rooms, except there was nothing careful in it now. "What is it," she said, "that you find?" A pause. The ducks on the water. The distant sound of the city. "I find," he said, "that I was wrong in every particular." Eleanor held this. She knew what it cost a man like this, whose code was precision, who did not apologize for things he meant, to say that he had been wrong in every particular. "I know," she said, "you were." He looked at her. "That is not what I expected you to say. An argument. A scene." She turned and resumed walking slowly. He fell into step beside her. "I have known I was not plain and dull since I was approximately 17, Your Grace. Your opinion of me in Shropshire was not evidence about me. It was evidence about the conditions under which you form opinions, when you are tired and being managed and want a subject closed." A silence longer than the others. "You are, I don't know a word for it," he said. "Insufferable is commonly used." "I was going to say extraordinary." Eleanor said nothing. The brooch seemed very warm suddenly for a piece of cold metal, and she was careful not to reach for it. "What are you going to do?" she said, "about Lady Sophia?" He did not answer immediately, which was the most honest thing he could have done. "I don't know," he said. "What I know is that I cannot pretend I feel about her what I—" He stopped. "What you feel," Eleanor said, for both of them. "Yes." They reached the end of the path where it curved back toward the gate, Marta's footsteps a quiet constant behind them. "I am not asking you for anything," Eleanor said. She turned to face him, her voice steady. "What you do about Lady Sophia, what you do about any of it, that is yours to determine. I am not a factor in that calculation unless you choose to make me one." "You are already a factor," he said. "That is rather the problem." Eleanor looked at him. He was close, closer than the library, closer than the ballroom, and he was looking at her the way she had been looking at him in unobserved moments, with the kind of attention that had stopped pretending to be something else. "Then the problem," she said, "is yours to solve." She meant it kindly. She said it firmly. And she walked to the gate and through it and onto the street, Marta falling into step behind her, and she did not look back, because she had cultivated the considerable discipline of not looking back, and because she was not entirely sure what her face was doing, and that was information she intended to keep to herself. The problem forced itself within the week. She was at a morning call at Mrs. Graves's house, a gathering of 6 women whose primary common interest was botanical illustration, but whose secondary interest, on this particular morning, was the topic that had spread from 3 drawing rooms and arrived in Mrs. Graves's sitting room fully formed. The Duke of Carrick had not formalized his understanding with Lady Sophia Wren. The Duke of Carrick had been observed at the Bond Street Lending Library on multiple occasions in the company of Miss Eleanor Hartwell of Shropshire. The Duke of Carrick had walked with Miss Eleanor Hartwell in the park. Eleanor sat with her teacup and listened to all of this with the expression of a woman reading about someone else. Mrs. Graves, perceptive and kind, caught Eleanor's eye and offered a small, sympathetic smile. Eleanor smiled back. She went home and sat with Jane and said in the flattest possible tone, "It appears we have become a topic of conversation." Jane set down her sewing. "How widespread?" "Widespread enough to reach Mrs. Graves's sitting room, which means it has reached everywhere that matters, and several places that don't." "Oh, Eleanor." "Don't look like that. I have done nothing requiring that face." "I know you haven't." Jane stopped, started again. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked at her hands, the brooch, the familiar cool weight. "Nothing," she said. "There is nothing for me to do. The problem, as I have told him, is his." She did not sleep well that night. She read until 2 in the morning, a traveller's account of the Mediterranean coast, useful and distracting, and ultimately insufficient. At some point she set it aside and looked at the ceiling and thought about grey eyes and the word extraordinary, and the sound of a man's exhale when he has said something true and is waiting to find out what it costs him. She touched the brooch in the dark, then she released it. She slept. He came to the house the next morning, not with a card sent in advance. He came, knocked, and was shown into the sitting room before Mrs. Hartwell had time to do more than press her hands together and look at Eleanor with wide eyes. Mrs. Hartwell remained in her chair throughout, present, proper, embroidery in hand. He sat. He did not accept tea. "I have spoken to Lady Sophia," he said. Eleanor went very still. "I told her that I could not, that my feelings did not, that it would not be honest to proceed." He stopped. He had planned what to say, and found, in the execution, that the plan was insufficient. She was gracious. Considerably more gracious than I deserved. She said she had known for some weeks that I was not present, Eleanor said quietly. He looked at her. "Yes." Mrs. Hartwell, by the window, made a very small sound and was still. "I am telling you this," Carwick said, "because you asked me to be accurate, And because I want you to know that what I said in the park was not strategy. I meant it. I know, Eleanor said. I am not asking you for anything today. He said this with precision, and she heard her own words return to her. I only wanted you to know that the obstacle, the one I made, is removed. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. He was sitting across from her in the small sitting room that Jane had filled with inexpensive flowers, and the morning light was doing him no disservice, and he was looking at her with the expression she had spent weeks cataloguing and could now finally name. Thank you, she said, for telling me. He nodded. He rose. He said goodbye to Mrs. Hartwell with a courtesy that would, Eleanor knew, keep her mother in good spirits for a week. At the door he paused. He did not turn. Friday, he said, the library. Eleanor said nothing. He left. Jane appeared through the inner door 30 seconds later, sewing still in hand, with the expression of a woman who has heard everything through a not-quite-closed door and intends to say none of it. Well, said Jane. Not a word, said Eleanor. Jane sat down and smiled at her sewing instead. Eleanor touched the brooch, the familiar cool weight, the old gold, the garnets that caught no light at all in the shadow of the sitting room. She held it and let herself feel for just a moment, in the privacy of her own chest, the particular warmth of a situation that has changed. Then she reached for her book. The library on Friday was not what either of them had planned. Eleanor arrived at 10:30 to find Carwick already there, not in the natural history section where their particular geography had established itself over the past weeks, but near the door, as though he had arrived and not yet decided to commit to staying. He had a book in his hand that he was not reading. Marta took her chair by the door, produced her knitting, and became invisible in the reliable way she had perfected over 6 weeks. Eleanor stopped. Carwick looked up. You came, he said. I come on Fridays. She moved past him toward the shelves. You appear to be blocking the philosophy section. He stepped aside. She selected a volume she did not particularly want and opened it at a random page, and they stood in the particular silence of two people who have said too much and too little, and are not certain which direction the next sentence ought to go. I have been thinking, he said, about what you said in the park. I said several things in the park. That the problem was mine to solve. She kept her eyes on the page. And have you solved it? I told you I had spoken to Lady Sophia. You told me you had ended a near understanding. That is not the same as solving a problem. She looked up. The problem, as I understand it, is not Lady Sophia. The problem is that you formed an opinion in the middle of a long, tedious evening and lived inside it comfortably for 4 weeks, and are now in the position of a man who has been wrong and must decide what to do about that beyond simply acknowledging it. He looked at her steadily. What would you have me do? I would have you nothing. She closed the book. You do not owe me action, Your Grace. You owe yourself honesty. I am trying to be honest with you. You are trying to tell me things that are true, she said. That is not always the same as honesty. A silence. He put his own book down on the shelf beside him. What is the difference? He asked. Eleanor considered him, the careful face, the grey eyes, a man not accustomed to being asked to go further than the statement of a fact, discovering that further is precisely where this conversation intends to go. Honesty, she said, is saying the thing you are not sure how it will be received. Truth is saying the thing you have already decided is safe. He was quiet for long enough that a woman browsing 2 shelves away glanced at them and looked away again. I think about you, he said, when I am not with you considerably. It is not comfortable. No, she said, I imagine it isn't. I think about what you will say to things. I find myself constructing arguments to test against you, in my own head, at unreasonable hours when I should be sleeping. Eleanor absorbed this without moving. I do not know what to do with that, he said. The women I have known have wanted specific things from me that I could identify and account for. You appear to want nothing from me, which is disconcerting. Yes. I want nothing from you that you have not freely offered, she said. There is a difference. He took a step toward her. Not dramatic. 1 step, enough to close the distance from 6 feet to 4, which in a library was a different conversation than in a ballroom. What if I want to offer more than I have, he said. Eleanor held her ground. Then you would need to say so plainly. He opened his mouth, and then the bell above the door sounded, and 2 women came in on a rush of street noise and laughter, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary air of a Friday morning. Carwick stepped back. Eleanor turned to her shelf. Tonight, he said quietly, the Pemberton Music Hall. Will you be there? My mother has accepted for us. Then I will find a moment. He retrieved his book. If you are willing. Eleanor looked at the spine of the volume in her hands. Political economy. She had grabbed it at random, and it had delivered something apt, which was not unlike the month she had just lived. I will be near the windows, she said. I usually am. He left. She stayed another 20 minutes, read 2 pages with genuine concentration, then put the book back in the wrong section and went home. The Pemberton Musicale was held in a long drawing room in Cavendish Square, lit with the lavish candle power of a family that understood that good lighting is not vanity, but hospitality. 40 people, gilt chairs in precise rows, a soprano from the Italian opera, performing to an audience that was approximately 30% paying attention and 70% conducting its own quiet business behind fans and between pieces. Eleanor stood near the windows, open 2 inches against the warmth of 50 candles and 40 bodies, and listened with the genuine pleasure of a woman who actually liked music and waited. He did not make her wait long. He came between the second and third pieces when the room reorganized itself, and a small current of movement brought him along the wall to where she stood. He did not sit. Neither did she. They stood side by side, facing the soprano, and spoke at the volume the music permitted. Low enough to be private, not so low as to be conspicuous. Mrs. Hartwell was 4 rows forward, fully absorbed in the performance. Jane, 2 seats from her mother, was not looking at the soprano at all. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask it. When you heard me in Shropshire, what did you think? Not what you felt, what you thought. She considered. I thought that you had confirmed something I already suspected. Which was? That I was invisible. That a man of your position would look at a woman like me and see category, not person. Second daughter, no fortune, serviceable. She paused. I thought you had simply said aloud what most people in that room were already thinking quietly. I was not surprised, I was disappointed, which is different. Disappointed in me, specifically. In myself, she said, for having thought you were paying attention. The way you moved through that room, you were watching people, not performing for them. I thought that meant you actually saw, and then I discovered that what you saw, when you looked at me, was nothing. He was quiet for a full musical phrase. I did not see you, he said. I looked and did not see. There is a difference. Is there? Looking is what the eyes do. Seeing requires choosing to look again. He turned his head toward her slightly. I have been choosing to look again for 4 weeks. The soprano finished her phrase. Polite applause. Eleanor did not move. What do you see now, she asked. They pause. A man deciding between caution and truth, making his choice. A woman who reads Malthus in order to argue with him, who wears her grandmother's brooch in a room full of diamonds without apology, who told me I was wrong with less anger than I deserved and more precision than I could manage, who goes to the library on Tuesdays and Fridays and does not arrange herself to be found and is there anyway. He stopped. Who is standing next to me right now, as if she is still deciding whether I am worth the effort. I am still deciding, Eleanor said. I know. He looked back at the soprano. I find I am willing to wait. Eleanor looked at the dark glass of the window, the thin gap of May air, her own faint reflection in the pane. The garnet brooch caught candlelight and held it, a small dark warmth at her collar. That, she said, is the most honest thing you have said to me. I have been practicing. She turned to look at him, and he was watching her with the expression she could now name without equivocation. Not careful, not performed. Simply a man looking at a woman he wanted to look at. Friday, she said. Friday, he agreed. The soprano began again, something slower, and they stood in the candlelit room side by side and did not speak, and it was the most comfortable Eleanor had been in a room full of people in all her 24 years. The gossip arrived in full on the following Monday. Eleanor had been expecting it. Gossip in London operated on a predictable schedule: event, observation, 24 hours of sorting, then deployment, and the Pemberton Musicale had provided sufficient material. By Monday morning, Mrs. Hartwell had 3 callers before 11, all of whom mentioned the Duke of Carrick within 4 minutes of arriving, with the theatrical casualness of people who had rehearsed the approach. Eleanor stayed in her room until noon. She was not hiding, she was reading. The distinction was meaningful to her, even if it would not have been to the callers downstairs. Jane came at 11:30, sat on the end of the bed and said, Mrs. Pembridge is currently telling Mamma that Lady Sophia has been seen twice at the milliner's since Thursday and appears perfectly well. Good. I'm glad she's well. Mrs. Pembridge does not appear glad. I think she had been hoping for at least one broken heart. Lady Sophia is not a woman who breaks where anyone can see it. Eleanor turned a page. Which I mean as a genuine compliment. Are you not going to ask what else is being said? I know what is being said. I have been in London 6 weeks. I understand the mechanism. Jane was quiet for a moment. Are you frightened? Eleanor set the book down. It was a fair question, and Jane was the only person she would permit to ask it. Yes, she said, and somewhat. Of what, specifically? Of having decided he is worth it and being wrong. She looked at her sister. I have revised my opinion of him 3 times already, and it keeps improving, which is either evidence that my first reading was bad, or evidence that I am now inclined to see him favourably and cannot trust my own judgment. Or, Jane said, it is evidence that a person who gets better the more you know him is simply a better person than he first appears. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. When did you become wise? I have always been wise. You were not paying attention. Eleanor picked her book back up. He has never been anything but honest with me. I know. Even when it was inconvenient. Even when it cost him something. I know that too. Jane moved toward the door. Eleanor. The brooch. Jane nodded at Eleanor's collar. You have stopped touching it. Eleanor's hand went to it involuntarily, then stopped. Jane smiled and left. Eleanor sat with her hand half raised, not quite touching the brooch, in the stillness of a woman who has just learned something about herself from her own body. She put her hand down. She went back to her book. She read the same page 4 times and retained all of it. He came to the house on Wednesday, card properly sent that morning. Mrs. Hartwell received him in the sitting room with the barely suppressed energy of a woman who has been waiting for this particular call for a month and intends to make it last. She remained throughout, embroidery in hand, positioned at the window with an optimized view of both parties. Eleanor came down in the grey dress, the brooch. Carwick stood when she entered. He looked like a man who had made a decision and arrived on the other side of it, not lighter exactly, but settled. The way a person looks when they have stopped arguing with themselves. Your Grace, she said. Miss Hartwell. He waited for her to sit, then resumed his seat. I wonder if I might beg a favour. You may ask for one. The almost amusement. There is a difference? There is always a difference. I would like, he said, to call on you formally, regularly. He held her gaze. With whatever intention the word regularly implies. Eleanor was quiet. I'm not asking for more than you are prepared to give, he said. I am asking for the chance to continue, with no pretense about what the continuation is for. You are asking to court me, Eleanor said, because she was not a woman who helped a man avoid the word he was reaching for. Yes. Formally, regularly. With your permission and your mother's. Mrs. Hartwell made a sound from the window that was technically a cough. Eleanor looked at her hands. At the brooch she could not see from this angle but could feel the cool, familiar weight of it. I have a condition, she said. He waited. You will not pretend, she said. Not to me, not about me, not about what you think or feel or have concluded. If you find at any point that you have overstated your regard or understated it, you will say so. I will not be managed. I know, he said. I would not. You did once, she said quietly. Not with me, with yourself. You managed your own conclusions about me into something convenient and lived there. I am asking you not to do that again. He absorbed this without deflecting it. You are right, I did. He met her eyes. I will not. She nodded once. Then yes, you may call. Mrs. Hartwell set down her embroidery and looked briefly at the ceiling with the expression of a woman offering silent gratitude. Carwick stayed 30 minutes. He drank his tea this time. He answered Mrs. Hartwell's questions about Derbyshire with patience and genuine warmth, which Eleanor noted and stored. He left at 1 o'clock, and at the door he turned, which was new. He looked at Eleanor directly. The brooch, he said. She waited. It suits you more than diamonds would. He said it the way he said most true things, without decoration, without waiting for her response, and left. Eleanor stood in the hallway after the door closed. She reached up and touched the brooch, the garnets, the old gold, the cool metal that had been warm all morning. She was smiling. She did not stop. 3 weeks of formal calling produced a rhythm Eleanor found, to her own slight surprise, entirely natural. He came on Mondays and Fridays. He stayed the acceptable length. He spoke to her mother with the courtesy of a man who understood that mothers are not obstacles, but constituencies. He and Eleanor talked about books, about politics, about his Derbyshire estate and her father's Shropshire library, about Ireland and Malthus and the Enclosure Acts, about small things and large ones. He argued with her, and she argued back. He conceded when she was right, and she told him when she was not. On the third Monday, Lord Peel appeared in the park with them, transparently delighted, talking more than necessary and noticing everything. Eleanor found she did not mind him. He had the quality of a man whose affections, once genuinely given, were worth something. On the second Friday, Jane walked with them and said almost nothing, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. On a Tuesday morning at the library, Carwick handed Eleanor a book without comment, a political economy volume she had mentioned wanting 2 weeks prior, which meant he had been thinking about the conversation 2 weeks prior, which meant he carried forward the things she said. She took the book and opened it, and did not remark on any of this, and they stood reading in companionable quiet for half an hour, Marta knitting steadily by the door. This, Eleanor thought, was what it looked like when a thing was real. The evening of the 5th week of his calling was warm, the kind of May evening that made London look better than it deserved. Mrs. Hartwell had gone to a card party at a neighbour's house. Jane had retired early with a headache that Eleanor privately suspected of being diplomatic. Marta had been given the evening off by Mrs. Hartwell herself, which suggested her mother's management of the situation was rather more deliberate than she let on. Carwick called at 7. He was told by the housekeeper that Mrs. Hartwell was not at home, and this was not the correct procedure. It was precisely the kind of thing that would be noted and discussed, asked whether Miss Hartwell was receiving. Eleanor, in the sitting room with a book and the window open 2 inches, heard the exchange. She set the book down. She looked at the brooch where it lay on the side table. She had taken it off to change for the evening and not yet put it back on, and picked it up and pinned it to her dress. "Send him up," she told the housekeeper, "and leave the door open." The door remained open. The housekeeper remained audible in the passage, which was sufficient. Eleanor had learned the geometry of propriety well enough to know where its actual boundaries lay. He came in looking like a man who had walked quickly and would not admit it. He stopped when he saw her. She was standing near the window in the blue dress she did not usually wear. Jane had been right about the blue, and the last of the evening light was coming through the glass, and the brooch was at her collar where it belonged. "Mrs. Hartwell is out," he said. "I told you she would be. She mentioned it last Monday." "Yes?" He did not move from just inside the door. "I remembered that." "I assumed you had." She gestured to the chair. "Sit down, Carwick." He sat. She sat across from him. The small sitting room warm and quiet, the window open, the city beyond at its May evening best, and the housekeeper's footsteps a steady presence in the passage. "I want to say something," he said. "You generally do." "Something I have not said yet." He looked at her with the expression she could now read without effort, not careful, not managed, not the face he wore in rooms full of people who wanted things from him, the face that was only for here. "I want to tell you precisely how wrong I was, not as a confession, as a record. You owe me no accounting. I want to give you one anyway." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. "In Shropshire I looked at you across a crowded room because Peel suggested I look at the end of a long evening after hours of being steered and managed, and I decided before I had properly focused and said the thing that would close the subject. I want you to understand what I was doing. I was not seeing you. I was defending myself." "I know," Eleanor said. "I know you know. I want to say it anyway." He looked at his hands for a moment. "The second time I saw you in the library on Bond Street, you told me you had heard and walked past me, and I stood there a full minute after you had gone. I had expected to feel cleared of the matter. Instead, I felt—" "What?" she asked. "Like I had lost something I hadn't been offered yet." The room was very quiet. The housekeeper moved in the passage. Outside, the city went about its indifferent business. "And then," he said, "every time I saw you, you were more than a category, more than I had language for, because I had spent years in rooms full of people trying very hard to be remarkable, and I did not recognize what actually remarkable looked like when it was standing in front of me in a lending library being precise about Pennant." "The 4th volume is the weaker one," Eleanor said. "I maintain that." He looked at her. "I know you do." "I'm not going to stop maintaining it." "I know that too. The expression that was only for here, only for her. I was wrong in the most complete way a person can be wrong. Not a mistake of information. I had no information. A mistake of attention, of care. You are the most worth-seeing person I have met in 10 years of rooms full of people trying very hard to be seen." He stopped. Eleanor looked at him. This man who had dismissed her in one careless sentence and spent 6 weeks earning the right to sit across from her in this small, warm room, who had ended a near engagement and drunk tea with her mother, and found her the book she wanted, and come tonight knowing full well that Mrs. Hartwell was at cards. She stood. She crossed the small room and stopped in front of him, and he looked up at her from the chair, and she thought, I have made decisions with less information and more fear, and this is neither. Edmund, she said. He stood, quickly, the way a man stands when he is startled into it, and they were close, the window light behind her, the brooch at her collar, 6 weeks of London compressed into this small, warm room with the door open and the housekeeper in the passage, and none of that mattering in the slightest. He kissed her. Not with hesitation. He had been hesitating for 6 weeks, and he was done with it. His hand came to her face, careful and certain at once, and the kiss was the thing that everything else had been moving toward, plain, direct, and more than she had known to expect. When he drew back, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. When she opened them, he was watching her with an expression she had no name for and did not need one. I love you, he said, not as a prelude to anything, not to require anything of you. I love you, and I wanted you to know it, said plainly, with nothing attached to it. Eleanor looked at him. The brooch was warm. The room was warm. The city beyond the window was doing its indifferent May evening business and had no idea. Edmund Fairclough, she said, you were the most aggravating beginning to a story I have ever been part of. I know. You dismissed me in one sentence and were overheard doing it, and then had the extraordinary arrogance to keep appearing in my library. Your library, he said, yes. And you have argued with me about Malthus and Ireland and the 4th volume of Pennant, which remains the weaker volume. It does not. She reached up and touched the brooch, not from anxiety, not from habit, but from the particular pleasure of a thing become intentional. I love you also, she said, inconveniently and entirely. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was only for here. Will you marry me? He said. Not a performance, 4 words, plain as everything else he had said tonight, and all the more considerable for it. Eleanor looked at the man who had been wrong in every particular, and had had the integrity to keep revising until he arrived at the truth. Yes, she said, obviously. He laughed. An actual laugh, short and unguarded, the first she had heard from him, and it was the best sound she had encountered in a season full of unexpected things. She laughed too, which surprised her somewhat. They stood in the sitting room as the evening light gave way to candles, not performing anything for anyone, and the housekeeper in the passage had the excellent discretion to remain entirely audible and entirely incurious. The engagement was announced on a Friday. This was not accidental. The notice appeared in the Morning Post and was followed within 24 hours by a volume of callers at the Marylebone House that exceeded anything the season had previously produced. Mrs. Hartwell received them all with the composure of a woman who has been waiting for this her entire adult life and intends to enjoy every moment of it. Jane sat beside her, said all the correct things, and glanced occasionally at Eleanor with the expression of someone who is very pleased and is being admirably restrained about it. Eleanor accepted congratulations with equanimity, deflected the more searching questions with the dry precision that had become her established social register, and counted the minutes until the last caller left. The last caller left at 4:30. At 5 o'clock, Carwick arrived. You timed that, Eleanor said at the door. I have known your calling hours for 2 months. It is not timing, it is arithmetic. She let him in. They sat in the empty sitting room. Mrs. Hartwell retired with a headache that was, for once, almost certainly genuine, and Jane had disappeared with the specific tact she had been deploying all season, and it was the first time since the announcement that Eleanor had been in a room without someone performing an opinion about her life at her. How was it? He asked. Comprehensive, she said. Mrs. Pembridge cried. I was not certain what to do with that. She cries at all news equally. I have seen her cry at a particularly large fish. Eleanor looked at him. That cannot be true. It is completely true. Peel witnessed it. He will confirm. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with the particular attention of a man collecting something he intends to keep. She was becoming accustomed to being watched this way. His attention was not the attention of a room, assessing and filing, but the attention of a man who had looked too quickly once and had been correcting the oversight with considerable thoroughness ever since. Your mother, he said, asked me 3 questions about the Derbyshire estate that were extremely specific. She has been reading about Derbyshire. I know, she quoted acreage at me. She is thorough. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. She is very happy. She has been worried about me for some years, not about my marriage prospects particularly, about whether I would be... She stopped. All right, he said. Chosen, she said, by something worth being chosen by. He was quiet. I am aware that I am not the most obvious candidate for that distinction, given how I began. No, she said, you are not, and yet... She looked at him. You see me, Edmund. You started badly and you corrected. which I think is worth more than having started correctly. I don't know that it is. I do. She tilted her head. A man who has always seen me would have nothing to overcome. You had to dismantle something you had built and look again. That is more interesting. He looked at her with the expression that was only for here. I want to say you are remarkable without it becoming a platitude. Then say it only when you mean it. I will always mean it. Then we shall see. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, the settled certainty of a man claiming something he has earned. She let herself feel the warmth of it, and the warmth of the room, and the warmth of the brooch at her collar. And it was enough. It was considerably more than enough. The wedding was in July in Shropshire, at the church where Eleanor had been baptized. She wore white, which was expected, and the garnet brooch, which was not. Jane, standing beside her, noticed the brooch and said nothing except to straighten it once, precisely, with the deft hands of a woman who has been managing her sister's collar since they were children. "Ready?" Jane said. "I have been ready since approximately the lending library," Eleanor said. "I know," Jane said. "I was being ceremonial." The church was small. The guests were those who had earned the right to be there, and the morning was the particular Shropshire morning, soft, a little grey, entirely itself, that Eleanor had grown up inside, and that had never seemed until now like something she might one day leave. She did not look at him until she was beside him. When she did, he was watching her with the expression she had first seen across a lending library, focused still, looking at her as though learning her, except that now there was nothing careful in it, no management, no caution. A man looking at the person he intended to look at for the rest of his life, with the full attention that 6 months had taught him to give. She held his gaze. She did not look away. The vicar began. The church was quiet. Outside, the Shropshire morning went about its business, indifferent and familiar, the way it always had. They spent the first weeks at the Derbyshire estate, which was everything her mother's research had suggested and more, large in the way of places long well loved, with a library that made Eleanor stop in the doorway and say nothing for a full minute. "Well," he said behind her. She walked in, ran her hand along a shelf, turned in a slow circle, reading spines. "You have the Pennant. 3rd and 4th volumes. I am going to need the 4th volume. To reread or to prove me wrong?" "Both." She turned to look at him, standing in the doorway of his library in his house that was now also hers, and felt the particular solidity of a life that has arrived somewhere true. "Both," she said again, more quietly. He crossed the room. He touched the brooch at her collar, not adjusting it, not remarking on it, just the brief certain contact of a man who has learned the particular habits of the woman he loves and counts them among the things he knows. "There is a chair by the window that gets the morning light," he said. "I thought you might want it." She looked at him. "You thought about which chair I would want." "I think about what you will want most of the time," he said. "I have mentioned this. You mentioned thinking about how I would argue with things. A chair is different." "Not entirely." He was looking at her with the expression that had no name and needed none. "You argue better in good light." Eleanor Fairclough, she was still assembling herself into that name which fitted better each day, looked at her husband and thought about the corridor in Shropshire and the library on Bond Street and the park in May and the small sitting room with the door open and the housekeeper in the passage, and about a brooch that had moved from anxiety to intention to the settled warm habit of a thing that means something because it always has. "I love you," she said, "just that." He said it back, plainly as he did everything as he had promised. And then he left her in the library with the morning light and the pennant and the chair by the window. She sat down. She opened to the 4th volume. She began.